Welcome to this section on dynamic range. Now, dynamic range is the range of brightness values that a camera can record, anything from too bright all the way to too dark for the camera's dynamic range, and detail will be lost or clipped, as it's called. So all black in the shadows or all white in the highlights, no matter of finagling it in post will bring back that detail. If it's been clipped, it's just gone. The camera didn't record it because it couldn't. Dynamic range is one of the largest determiners of image quality and cost in a camera. So one of the reasons people will pay more for a cinema camera is not just resolution, it's because of this dynamic range. It can retain the highlights better. It can see into the shadows better and give you that more lifelike image like your eyes can see, because our eyes can see extremely well into shadows and extremely well into bright highlights. Cameras are pretty limited, and so the more expensive cameras can get closer to what our eyes can see. And some of the newest cameras coming out today with 17 stops at dynamic range are getting really close to what our eyes can see. Dynamic range is typically measured in what are called stops. What's interesting about stops is that each stop is twice as bright as the stop that came before it, and going down the list, each stop is half as bright as the stop above it. The amount of light each stop represents truly goes up exponentially. If you plot it on a curve, it gets really crazy really quickly. DSLRs from 10 years ago or so, think like the 5D Mark II. I had this camera, it was great. It was one of the first full frame video DSLRs. It had a dynamic range of about 12 stops almost, like 11.8, something around that range. Really high-end cameras nowadays, like the Alexa 35, have a dynamic range of 17 stops. Now that might not sound like a big jump, but because it doubles every step, it means the Alexa 35 can theoretically see detail in things that are 32 times brighter than a 5D Mark II. Now again, that's theoretical, but I think you get the picture that dynamic range is a big deal. If your camera has low dynamic range, bright things will go completely white and have no detail. Same thing with the shadows, they'll go completely black, and that can give a really cheap, unprofessional look to footage, especially nowadays. It's a big reason why digital cameras look so much better today than 10 years ago. It's not just the resolution, right? Like a lot of what we consume is still 1080p, which we had 10 years ago, right? It's in that dynamic range. I recommend looking for cameras that have around 14 stops at dynamic range. This is really where footage starts to get very professional, but it also helps you a lot with shooting outdoors. Like shooting in bright sunlight where you've got bright light coming down through trees and bright highlights pinging off of tree branches, and then underneath this rock or underneath that tree it's really, really shadowy, really, really dark, and having both of those in the frame at the same time is a real struggle for cameras. Getting good dynamic range is also a reason not to shoot in the standard picture profile of a camera. Often the standard profile clips some of what the sensor is capable of. We'll get more into that in the next section called log video. Log video is a picture profile. It's a way to record your footage in camera. One way to think of log video is sort of like raw video, but it's like raw light in a way. Okay, there is a separate thing from Canon called raw light, but what log gives you is the ability to record the full dynamic range of your camera. Whatever that sensor is capable of, log video will allow you to record it. Traditional shooting settings have a lot of contrast, which gives you a pleasing image straight out of camera. So that's good. We expect, if we hit record, we want the footage that comes out to look at least decent, to look correct. And so that's what a standard picture profile gives us. But on this other hand, log video, also called log gamma, is recording with little to no contrast. So instead it has a contrast curve like a logarithm, hence the name log video. But hold on, what's a logarithm? Well, it's the opposite of an exponential curve growth. Okay, so a logarithm is like exponential flattening off. Okay, so that's weird, right? Well, if you dive one layer deeper, it starts to make sense. Brightness values in the real world grow at an exponential rate. So for a light source to appear 2 times brighter, it needs to actually output 4 times as much power. Okay? So if you want to know more about all this, it's you can look up something called the inverse square law. It's really, really useful for lighting, for video and photography. I won't go into it here. Now you might be thinking, doubling for every level. And you're like, oh, that sounds a lot like what we learned in the last section about dynamic range. And you're absolutely right. And that's why they chose to create stops on that exponential scale, is because it mirrors what we see with our eyes in the real world. So log footage is recording this exponentially brighter footage onto a logarithmic scale. So what's a logarithmic scale? Like I told you, it's like an exponentially flattening off scale. If we plot one, it goes like 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. You get the picture. Or like 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 512. You know, we're plotting a scale where each level is twice as much as the one before it, and we're doing that evenly. Okay, so if we try to record footage on a logarithmic scale, instead of the typical scale of standard video, log video tries to convert that exponential brightness, and it tries to counteract it with a logarithmic scale. The result is a brightness scale that follows a linear increase in brightness rather than an exponential increase in brightness. But what are we left with when we do that? Well, the answer is super gray looking video. Believe me, it looks terrible straight out of camera. But fear not, every camera manufacturer with a log capable camera also provides a color lookup table that will normalize your footage so it looks good again automatically. You get the picture. Now don't worry what a lookup table is. We're going to touch again on that later in editing and color grading and color processing pipeline, all of that kind of jazz. So don't worry about lookup tables right now. But CT, you might be asking, why would I go through that extra step just to have my footage look the same again at the end of the day, as if we'd shot it normally? That's just like more steps, but you get the same result, right? Now I'm glad you asked this, okay? So let's look at a scene with a lot of contrast. We got really bright brights, we got some really dark darks. So I've opened my blinds here. Here is a great chance to look at the difference between log footage and standard footage. So I'm recording this right now in log, and then real quick I'm gonna get up and switch this to standard. Okay, so here we are in the standard profile. I have not changed any camera exposure settings, none of that jazz. The only thing that I changed was the picture profile. This won't affect the shadows so much. It really has to do with the highlights. I hope we're illustrating that pretty well here. No matter how much finagling, no matter how much you're playing with the dials and adjusting things, whatever, in post-production, you can't bring back 100% blown out highlights. The information is just gone. It wasn't recorded. It was recorded as 100% white. There is nothing you can do. Other ways we could try to fix this would be to just darken the scene. So let me do that real quick. Okay, so here in the standard profile, I've just darkened the scene. And as you can see, outside, we got great exposure, looking good. Inside now, it's a little on the dark side, right? Now we can try to lift up the dark areas in post. It's okay, you know, you could do some stuff, but also there is just detail lost back here, right? Now we could just try to split the difference, and let's see what that looks like. Here's trying to split the difference exposure-wise. Still, darks are too dark, bright's a little too bright, but we tried to like find a middle ground that might be okay for us. Let's try bringing the brights down. Let's try bringing the shadows over here up and see if we can make it look okay. And sometimes you can get close, but it always just looks a little bit off, not right. And even if you get close, it doesn't look professional. It doesn't look correct. It doesn't look very pleasing. And that's kind of what I'm getting to with shooting in log. It really saves you in these challenging lighting scenarios. In an ideal world, I'd just call the lighting department and they would come to this window and they would put a neutral density gel over the window, which would cut down on the exposure. So then everything outside would look correct. And then we'd work with the lighting inside to bring this part up and all that. But not all of us have a fully equipped lighting guy or a whole lighting department to do all this stuff. And we got to move fast and we got to get the shot and all this stuff. And that's why working with log footage is so valuable, because then we can really fix it in post. We can bring this up and that down a little bit and really get a pleasing image really easily. So I'm going to switch back to log just so you can see what's going on with this shot. Oh, that's so much better. Here we are in log again. Look at this. I can bring in my shadows. I have no clipping highlights. It's a miracle. It looks so good. Ah, love you log footage. Thank you for existing. And remember, this isn't a raw format. We crammed all of that brightness information into a more typical video format. And with just a change to the brightness curve, we don't have all of the high processing, all the storage requirements, all the power requirements of a raw format, but we're still getting the main benefit, which is the brightness, the dynamic range. What it doesn't give you, however, is the same amount of white balance control that RAW does. With RAW, you can completely botch your white balance on a shoot, and then later in post, you can just, there's a little slider and you can just adjust it and fix it in post and it looks like you shot it correctly. But in my opinion, you shouldn't be botching your white balance anyway. And if you do shoot in log and in 10-bit, you'll still get a lot of the flexibility in the white balance department. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself, and we're going to talk about all of that a lot more in the next section called bit depth. I'll see you there.